Good to see everybody tonight. We are going to begin by reviewing the New Testament time periods that we covered last Sunday. And just to review and make sure that those are fairly well fixed in our minds. And then with the rest of the time tonight, we're going to go back and start putting some scripture attachment to some of the bullet points. Laura clarified for me that she indicated that I hadn't been real clear as to my intention with that. It's true that we've already put the broad scripture limits to each of our time periods. For example, the life of Christ, that's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And we've even attached some with chapters. For example, before the flood is the first 5 chapters of Genesis. The flood is the next 5 chapters of Genesis. What we want to do going forward is to put chapters with bullet points. Now, we're not going to do that for our New Testament books. Excuse me. But for example, if this were one of our Old Testament time periods, I'm just not going to switch back and forth on the slides. Years of preparation, we would say, okay, well, that's, these chapters go with that bullet point. I realize that's going to be a lot of information. And I realize that may be, that's more than most of us, if not all of us, are going to memorize. But in familiarizing ourselves with it, number one, you'll be surprised how much of that you retain, and at least in having looked at it. And then secondly, it's going to be a part of your it's going to be a part of your quote unquote cheat sheet. And so we're just going to kind of work on that part of it together. Don't dread it. Don't get overwhelmed by it. Don't get scared off of the study by it. Laura's feedback is the only feedback about that I've gotten. So unless somebody flags me down or shoots me in the head first, that's what we're gonna do. But I am still open to your input about this going forward. All right. So let's review this section on the life of Christ, and I'm going to do a little bit of doodling on the screen as we go through this. All right. So I'm just going to go ahead and put all of these up here on the screen at the same time. These 7 are a broad outline of the life of Christ. And so let's just talk briefly, and this will just kind of help these make a little bit more sense to you. Let's talk briefly about some of the things. We're by no means going to exhaust these, but just talk a little bit about what each of these bullet points represent. When we talk about the years of preparation, what we are referring to are all of the years that lead up to the things that we best know Jesus for, right? His quote unquote public ministry was about 3.5 years. And so, but he didn't get started in that until the age of 30. So when we talk about the years of preparation, we are referring to about 30 years of time. And so when we talk about that 30 years, what are we talking about? What are some of the things that fit into that 30-year time frame?
Birth.
All right. Even before the birth of Jesus, take one step back in the gospel accounts, the birth of
John the Baptist.
John the Baptist. Okay. So that would be included. And we include that in an outline of the life of Jesus because John the Baptist's role was to prepare the way for Jesus, right? So we would begin with the birth of John the Baptist, and then it is the story of Jesus. We don't know a lot about about Jesus growing up, about his childhood and young adulthood, but what are some of the things that we know?
I guess the most memorable would be at 12 years of age when he remained in Jerusalem after a trip by the family.
All right, good. So the family went to Jerusalem. Jesus was about 12. Jesus, without his earthly parents' knowledge, stayed behind. And you have that famous and I think tone-setting statement of Jesus, I must be about my Father's business. All right, good. All right, what else? Where was he reared?
Nazareth.
All right, born in Bethlehem, reared in Nazareth. This comes up later as actually one of the attacks, one of the ways in which some of his enemies attempt to dismiss his influence. He was the son of a fill in the blank.
A carpenter.
Carpenter. Yeah, he was a carpenter's son. And so so all of that fits into this first 30-year period, including John's work, John the Baptist's work in kind of paving the way and getting things rolling, if you will. All right, so then you have the second bullet point, which is the beginning of Jesus' ministry, and this is estimated at 3 to 6 months. And we can't be precise about some of this because it's not like the gospel accounts attach it to a calendar. But the beginning of Jesus' ministry, some of the early events that in many ways were preparatory, that were, again, moving the story along. This is not the bulk of his work, but this is the time in which it's getting started. So you have in this time frame, you have things like Jesus' baptism, his temptations, his first miracle in Cana of Galilee, in Jerusalem, the first time that he purged the temple. All of this happened, or much of this happened in starting in Galilee, then in Judea, and then leaving Judea and returning to Galilee. But about 3 to 6 months. The great Galilean ministry, as it's labeled in this outline, is the largest chunk of Jesus' public work. And it's about 18 to 24 months. And this is the part of Jesus, this is the part of Jesus' life with which we're probably the most familiar. This is the time period um, of most of Jesus' miracles, and the bulk of, or I'd say the bulk, a lot of his teaching, some of the most famous teaching that Jesus does. Uh, Most of John's 7 signs, at least the 6 of the 7, all fall after Jesus has begun. The first one, the wedding feast in Cana of Galilee, but then uh, the signs that follow happen during this time frame. A lot of Jesus miracles. The Sermon on the Mount falls early in this time frame. There's a lot of stories. There's a lot of events in the life of Jesus that fit into this, about the order of which we can't be precise. That's not the point. The point is this is this is a huge chunk of Jesus' work. That brings us to the periods of retirement. This is about sorry, I'm having trouble here. This is about 6 months. And it begins 1 year before his death. And so again, we've said this is not about Jesus quitting working. Retirement refers to him uh, withdrawing from Galilee, withdrawing from the larger crowds, and spending more time, or at least attempting to spend more time, with just the 12 apostles. Um, it is a very intense period. We don't have the kind of detail that we might have of the great Galilean ministry, for example. But the overall tone of this period is very intense, where Jesus is especially focused on those that are closest to him. That begins at the Passover, the time of the Passover, about 1 year before Jesus is crucified, around the following Passover. So that's how we can mark that. The close of his ministry is another period of about 6 months. That obviously would be about 6 months before his death. It begins when Jesus comes to Jerusalem at the Feast of Tabernacles, or the Feast of Booths, as it's sometimes called in John chapter 7. And so from this point forward, everything is rapidly moving toward Jerusalem. And so while he spent a great deal of time in Galilee, and now in Perea, Decapolis, etc., in his periods of retirement, everything is moving toward Jerusalem. And so that's what this period is all about. He more clearly talks about his impending death, in trying to prepare those closest to him for that eventuality. That brings us to the last week. Quite literally, that is the last week, beginning from the time that Jesus arrives in Bethany, probably on a Friday evening. This includes the we call the triumphal entry on Sunday, his various conflicts with the Jewish leadership throughout the week, and then his crucifixion on the Friday of that week. The Passover with his disciples on Thursday, the institution of the Lord's Supper. All of that is involved in the last week. And then you have the resurrection days. Um, and according to Acts chapter 1, uh, how many days did Jesus appear to his disciples and others um, between the time of his resurrection and his ascension back to the Father?
40 days.
40 days. This is, I was trying to make sure that I got the verse right. This is Acts chapter 1, verse 3. To these he also presented himself alive after his suffering by many convincing proofs, appearing to them over a period of 40 days and speaking of the things concerning the kingdom of God. And so again, we don't have a lot of uh, detail about those days. We know some of Jesus' appearances, and um, we know some of those interactions, but Acts 1 and verse 3 indicates that there was a lot more, and that of which we don't have a record. But again, Jesus was preparing his apostles. He was getting them ready for his absence and for the work that he was going to be the work that they rather were going to be doing after his ascension back to the Father. Just as a side note, you have another 10 days, and that brings us to the day of Pentecost, just to give you a sense of timing. All right. Does anybody have any questions about that? I thought it might be helpful, rather than just, 7 bullet points, a list of words on a screen, if we actually took a little bit of time, obviously not in any detail at all, to just kind of narrate through those so that we get a feel for what we're talking about, and again attach some rough time estimates, some rough time frames to those periods. All right, anybody got anything about that? Okay. All right. We talked about the early church, the book of Acts covering about 30 years, and the division of Acts chapters 1 through 12, and then 13 through 28. I think that's all pretty self-explanatory. I don't think there's a lot of other detail that we need to go into. The only thing that I might add to this is that, just as the second half, not literally a clean half, but as the second half of the book of Acts seems to focus on the work of Paul, many have suggested that the first half seems to focus on the work of Peter. I would put a question mark with that, just because while Peter might be a major character, he's not the kind of dominant character, the kind of focused character that Paul is in the second half of the book. So I don't use that as a description quite like some others do. Again, that's not to push Peter aside. He's certainly a major character, but he's not the focal point in the same way that Paul is in the second half of the book. I sent a text message about this last Sunday evening. Diana's question was if there was a reason why these books were listed in this particular order. And in that moment, I had a complete lapse of absolutely all memory. And the answer to that was yes, that this is the order in which um, these books uh, were written. And what I meant to do and completely forgot to do was to uh, add to this, because I certainly don't have this memorized, even though I ought to, was to add to this the approximate dates and locations from which these were written. And I'm not even going to attempt to do that on the fly. So I am going to write myself a post-it note. And all that would do would be to allow you to place these books into their context in the book of Acts. And that would be helpful maybe in recognizing, okay, this is what was going on with the Apostle Paul. This is where he was on his journey. For example, he had just been to Thessalonica, and so now he's writing back to them, just as an illustration of that. So I'm writing myself a post-it note right now. Now, as long as I don't lose my post-it note. Okay, so I'll try to remember to do that. I intend to do that for tonight, and it just completely and totally slipped my mind. All right, but at least up to that point, if you don't ask me about dates or locations of those 6 letters, are there any other questions about any of this New Testament material? All right. Okay, so what I want to do tonight is to begin to put some specific attachments to some of the some parts of of what we have already discussed, some of the bullet points. So let's back up to the beginning. It's a good place to start. We've already talked about this period as a whole being covered in Genesis chapters 1 through 5. But let's talk about each of these bullet points and where we're going to read about them. And we'll start at the beginning, because honestly, this is the easiest one. And this will just kind of give you a template that we're going to attempt to follow as we go along. Oops. Didn't mean to do that. Nope. How did I jump 2 slides at once? All right. I did it again. There we go. All right. So Genesis chapters 1 through 5. Now, not all of them are going to be this neat and tidy, but this one is particularly easy. If I want to read the stories of creation, where am I going to go for that?
Genesis chapter 1.
All right, good. That's the idea. That's what we are. That's what we're going for. We're going to assign chapters to each of these. If I want to read about Adam and Eve in the garden, where am I going to read that? Take a wild guess. Okay, good. All right, the Bekejians are on top of it tonight. Wow, I don't know what just happened. All right, y'all stick with me for just a minute here. Having technical difficulties. All right, so when we talk about We talk about creation, it's chapter 1. Adam and Eve in the garden is chapter 2. I bet you can tell me what chapter we read about the first sin. Don't make me
3.
wait. 3, the story of Cain and Abel, chapter 4. And then
4.
the generations that transition us from the creation stories to the time of the flood, we're going to read about those in chapter 5. And so that's the kind of thing we want to do. Now, not all of them are going to be so neat and easy and tidy. I get that. But if we can have a general idea of where things are, we get ready to go, teach someone, we get ready to go share the story with someone, or for that matter, just teaching our kids Bible stories, or our kids ask us questions, or we're talking to a friend at work and they say, I've always wondered about, um, we can point them to the right place. All right. So that one is incredibly easy. Let's move on to the period of the flood. When when we want to talk about the flood itself, where are we going in the book of Genesis?
6,
Starts in
8,
chapter
7.
6. That's the easy part. But the story of the flood itself spans over actually three chapters. It's not just in a single chapter. So, not for example, in chapter 6, you have God announcing his intention to destroy the earth by water, and his acknowledgement of Noah as being uniquely righteous in the world. Chapter 6 tells us about the preparations that were made, the ark that was built. And chapter 7 then tells us about the flood coming and the destruction that was accomplished. And then chapter 8 is the flood subsiding, the water receding. You have the story of Noah sending out the various birds that we remember. So the story of the flood itself is 3 chapters, 6, 7, and 8. Now, when we talk about the next 4 bullet points, when we talk about, well, I don't know what's going on, why I'm having so much trouble tonight. When we talk about the next 4 bullet points of that section, meat given for food, the law of capital punishment, the covenant of the rainbow, and Noah's drunkenness, and subsequently the curse on Canaan. When we talk about those 4, all of those fall into chapter 9. I give up. I don't know what's going on with our technology tonight. All of those fall into Genesis chapter 9. And then the last chapter of this section is chapter 10, and that composes the generations which transition us from the time of the flood to our next Bible time period, which is what?
Scattering of the people.
All right, the scattering of the people. All right. So when we talk about the scattering of the people, all of this is in one chapter, Genesis chapter 11. We are not going to get to the point of breaking down verse numbers, so don't panic on me, okay? All of this is in Genesis chapter 11. The building of the Tower of Babel, God's displeasure with that, the division of the languages, and then you have the generations of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, the sons of Noah. And those generations transition us from the scattering of the people to our next Bible time period, which is what?
Patriarchs.
The Patriarchs. All right. The Patriarchs. All right. The Patriarchs are the rest of the book of Genesis, chapters 12 through 50. Let's talk about what chapters belong to each of those patriarchs. Genesis 12 through 50. The story of Abraham is really the largest chunk of that. Abraham's story goes through Genesis chapter 25. And so Genesis chapter 12 through 25, you have Abraham's death recorded in Genesis chapter 25. Some of these are, these are not nice, neat, tidy, clean breaks. For example, all right, Isaac is born in Genesis chapter 21. The story of Isaac being offered by Abraham is in chapter 22. His marriage is in 24. We have a discussion of Isaac's sons in Genesis chapter 25. Here, the point I'm making is that as we give these chapter divisions, we're not talking about the point at which some of these characters enter the scene or enter the story. We're talking about the point at which they become the patriarch of the family, at which point they become the central character of the story. Does that make sense? Do you understand the distinction that I'm making there? All right. So as long as Abraham's alive, Abraham is the patriarch. And so after Abraham's death in chapter 25, then Isaac assumes the primary role. And again, you see, and again, when we give chapter divisions, we're going to say that Isaac, kind of the middle of that chapter in 25, Isaac becomes the primary character in 25, and that goes through chapter 28. Let's see here. All right, in chapter 28, Jacob takes on the central role of the story. Chapter 27 is the story of Jacob and Esau, and Jacob being disguised as Esau to receive the blessing of his father. And so chapter 28, Jacob becomes the central character of the story. He's fleeing from Esau. You have his marriages, and then his return, to Canaan. You might the story of Joseph is central through chapter 35. Chapter 36 focuses on Esau. Now, I realize that Esau is not a bullet point in this section, and that's because Esau wasn't one of the patriarchs. That doesn't mean he's not an important character. It just means he wasn't he's not part of the story, or that he's not one of the patriarchs through whom the lineage of this family is going to be traced. His descendants are significant in the Bible story, but they're not part of the patriarch story. But you could put a parenthesis here with Esau, chapter 36. And then the story of Joseph picks up with chapter 37 and goes through Genesis chapter 50. All right. I apologize for the technical difficulties. I thought that I could telestrate and talk at the same time. And maybe I could do that if the technology cooperated, but it didn't tonight. So I'm sorry for that distraction. We're about out of time. So thank you for studying with me tonight. And thank you for your patience through all of that. Hope you all have a great week. And Lord willing, we'll study together Wednesday night and see each other again next Lord's Day morning. Take care. Y'all have a great week. Good night, everybody.
Thank you.